r/NuclearRevenge. I destroyed my family friend's business and credibility. This story is a very long one, so I'll put a TL doctor at the bottom. Also apologies for a lack of formatting. I'm on mobile. The background. A few years after I started university, a friend of my mother's, who we will call Cook, started what can be generously called restaurant in a small town a couple hours outside of the city we lived in. It was really a glorified hot dog stand in a golf course. My mother had invested money into this business, so she had a personal stake in ensuring its success. That meant that she would often enlist us, aka my brother and I, to wait her when she could not do it herself. And my brother hated this guy, though I don't blame him. Cook had no idea how to run a business, and he was completely uninterested in learning. He was also completely computer illiterate, and had me set up the Google account for his business. And in order to get us to work in his business, he would pick one of us up from our home, drive us 2 hours or so out of town, and we were basically stuck there until we were driven back due to the fact that neither of us had a driver's license. And since my brother had problems with this guy, legit concerns that were brushed off as him having a bad attitude, I was the one who more often than not had to spend 2 to 10 days at a time there, stuck in a barely livable house, until I was laid back home. My mother was no better. She would often volunteer us that we would be working 2 days in the middle of a week, making job hunting a very difficult thing for my brother and I. Furthermore, she treated us not as employees, but as her children. Thus, any mistake was clearly our fault, and not because neither of them could a. Train staff, b. use a computer at all, c. manage a business at all, d. utilize my brother and I in the most effective way, considering my brother had already graduated university, and I was working towards a double major in business. Furthermore, they were completely unprofessional. They would host shouting matches in Chinese, where customers to hear, and the kitchen was filthy, despite Cook's insistence that the kitchen was the cleanest place in a restaurant. Yeah, right. An ice rink was less slippery than the ground in there, and he would routinely touch cooked food after handling raw meat, and I distinctly remember sweeping up what I thought was a green bell pepper, only to realize it was a moldy onion ring. Even the stove area was dripping grease. Literally, a biggest drop landed on my arm one time. They could not train staff at all. They had hired 5 people in the first year, and none of them came back the next. Cook in particular was especially two-faced, and how he handled customers. He would smile at them and greet them, remembering details from previous conversations, and then turn to me and say in Chinese about how they're all stupid stingy retirees with too much money and the free time on their hands. All of this left a great feeling of resentment for both me and my brother. Not only was it effectively trapping us to work for this completely incompetent individual, we would get basically nothing out of it. This was particularly frustrating for me because, as a business student at the time, I could see all there was the place could improve. I even offered to write up some policies, do some inventory management, and take a look at the administrative side, just to help out and get some experience for myself. They kept insisting that they didn't need it. Sure, we were paid bare minimum, and the guy did know how to cook, but we have to bear the brunt of their frustration, while hiding the fact that we were sick of helping out, until we couldn't anymore. The incident. Last year, I graduated university. It was not as happy of a time as it should have been, because my grandpa passed away the week before. I couldn't even celebrate the night before I walked the stage because I had to give part of the eulogy the previous day, and b. I had to mediate an incident between my brother, my mother, and Cook because my mother couldn't. No pre-graduation shots for me because I was stuck on the phone for 3 hours listening to how insensitive Cook was over the fact that my grandpa just passed away. But I figured that once I walked the stage and I had my diploma, I could spend that next week job hunting. No dice. Immediately after I graduated on the Monday afterwards, my mother volunteered me that I had to work 10 days in the restaurant. I lasted 6 before it happened. By all accounts, it wasn't that busy of a day to start off with. There was a breakfast brunch for Father's Day that barely anyone attended, and most people that did show up wanted to order off the menu. But both Cook and my mother were incredibly stressed out, and both of them were taking it out on me. My mother spent the day micromanaging me and finding flaws in every little thing I did, like cleaning an empty table over clearing plates from a table out on the deck, to not immediately refilling coffee or water when a glass or mug was half full, to not table touching every 5 minutes. Cook just shouted a lot and gave contradictory orders every 2 minutes. But it was the combination of my mother and Cook screaming at me for a mistake I didn't even make, something about a sauce that a customer requested, but they got mad about, refusing to listen to me, literally shutting me down when I opened my mouth, and Cook mocking me for breaking down in tears. I remember him saying, "You're 25, you should know better than to cry over a stupid mistake." Made me realize that not only could I not handle it anymore, but I wanted to burn the place to the ground. I booked a flight out of the province that day and left a week later. I didn't even tell my mother when or why I left. The revenge. Remember how I said that not only were they completely unprofessional, but also completely computer illiterate? See, despite the fact that I was no longer in the province, I still had all the login information for the business. Furthermore, because I knew all the laws that he blatantly refused to learn, I knew all the violations that he had committed in the business. For the first part of my revenge, I signed out his computer from the Google account. I don't think it was really necessary, since he never used that computer in the first place for anything other than porn, but I want to make sure that he and my mother wouldn't be able to stop me. Before I left the province, I claimed the business in review sites using the email and the business phone number. Then, I blasted every single review, positive or negative, with all the shit he used to say about customers. Any negative review was immediately mocked. Any positive review was left with a note of "thank you, you cheap b." Any questions were met with hostility, and it basically boiled down to "I'm right, you're wrong." I also make mentions about how he didn't wash his hands in the kitchen, and the stuff that they are yelling in Chinese are insults about uppity customers. Given that it was a tourist-based town, I'm fairly certain that deep dip of sales that my brother mentioned later on was because of all those. And no one suspected a thing, because my mother and Cook didn't know how to work the internets and my brother didn't care enough to look up the business. Next, I meticulously documented all the complaints that I had between my brother and myself, as well as the ones from the few people Cook had hired, but never kept, because he could not train them. I reported the 2 times that I slipped in his kitchen, incidents where he refused to wash his hands in between handling salad and raw meat, because it took too long. And I handed those off to the health services department. I also anonymously informed the tax revenue agency that he was severely underreporting income, as employees were instructed only to write down the credit debit receipts to report in sales. The third part of my revenge wasn't really my part, to be honest. Rather, it was because of his own incompetence. As I said before, he was completely computer illiterate. I didn't even have to lock out the person he hired to do accounting, because he didn't bother reporting his expenses, except hand them a garbage bag full of receipts. To be honest, I felt kind of sorry for them, but because their hands were tied, they couldn't dispute any of the claims that I made. What I did do, however, was text them all the things that my mother and Cook said about them, so that they wouldn't bother trying to defend his ass. They quit a month before the shit hit the fan, meaning that Cook was left holding the bag. So naturally, given that the business wasn't making near as much money to make rent, let alone pay off all this fines that he was slapped down with, the government repossessed everything. From everything in the dinky little house that he was renting for business purposes to every single fork and knife he bought. Because of all the health code violations, he couldn't find a job as a cook again, which was his only job for about 30 years. And because the tax revenue agency knew how bad he was with managing businesses, they naturally denied him when he requested a permit to open up a growing operation. As far as I know, he's no longer in contact with my family, but his brother-in-law, who is my mom's hairstylist, mentioned that he had to move somewhere else to get away from all the bad reputation. My mother mostly got off scot-free because all of the business permits and licenses were under his name, but she lost quite a lot of money, and last I heard my family had to move into a smaller house, and no one knew that I was the one who was doing it. My brother suspected, as he relayed details of what had happened to me, but I never confirmed it. Not that he would tell my parents, because honestly, fuck that hellstrand. As for me, I'd like to say that everything's sunshine and roses, but my decision to impulsively move provinces had its ups and downs. I did manage to find a place to live and a place to work, so at least I'm alive. It's hard, but I'd rather be doing this than going back. Edited for formatting, and for some additional details. I have so much on that place, so if anyone wants to know more, just let me know. It feels good to get it out there finally. TL. Doctor, my mother and her family friend forced my brother and I to work in their completely mismanaged business. I left home and proceeded to completely destroy it.